Okay, good evening and welcome to tonight's Fireside Chat for Thursday, January 19th. We're going to begin, first of all, by indicating our conference, which will be happening, Schiller Institute conference, which will be happening on February 4th, Saturday, February 4th. It's entitled The Age of Reason or the Annihilation of Humanity. There's an invitation which motivates the conference, and I want to refer to two elements of that invitation. One of the paragraphs states, there is now an attempt to establish global NATO through an interconnected network of military treaties. The NATO-European Union Agreement, the Australia-United Kingdom-United States Partnership, the UK-Japan Reciprocal Access Agreement, which look more and more like a march toward a global showdown with Russia and China. Their rise is seen as an existential threat. In the mind of people like Evan Ellis, the U.S. Army War College's resident expert on South American-Chinese relations, there will be an inevitable war with China over Taiwan no later than 2027, and that war will be global. Therefore, Ellis argues, South American countries cannot be allowed to cooperate with China because the many infrastructure projects in the region could be used by China in the projected global conflict as, quote, intermediate staging bases for attacks against the U.S. supply of food and critical minerals, etc. It should be clear to any sane person, global war will be nuclear, and that will be the end of civilization. And it says more, then it makes the point that we have to discuss the principles upon which the future order of humanity can be built in order to be able to self-govern ourselves. Now, the purpose of this conference, just to say, is that we are not here to lay out the problem. The problem we have spent quite a bit of time laying out, and we specifically did something last Saturday on that, in which we described the problem of what we call the International Assassination Bureau. And you can take a look at that conference, which featured many presentations. And we didn't just talk about JFK and his assassination or Martin Luther King and his, but we tried to give a picture of a globally deployed process of either assassination, successful assassination, as in the case of figures from Germany and Italy, or unsuccessful assassination, as in the case of the former great president of France, Charles de Gaulle, against whom there were over 30 assassination attempts. We also featured something unknown to most Americans and actually unknown to most people in Europe as well, which is that the assassination of the first president of an independent Congo, Patrice Lumumba, and that was in January of 1961, just 2 days before Kennedy would be sworn in as president of the United States. Lyndon LaRouche, in a 1992 interview that he gave, identified that assassination as being the beginning of the unraveling of the process of the International Assassination Bureau changing the course of history in the transatlantic world. So we did a lot of that on Sunday. What we're now going to do, what this conference is about, is something but much different. And the invitation ends by saying, it is high time that we bring the political, economic, and social order on earth into cohesion with the actual physical laws of the universe, which will also give rise to an unbounded optimism about the creative lawfulness which underlies creation. If we change our thinking in this way, we can shape our future in ways few people have an inkling of today. We will soon use thermonuclear fusion power commercially and solve energy scarcity. We will cooperate to make Africa the promising continent of the future. We will cooperate on international space, science, and travel. And we will increase longevity by discovering cures for many diseases. We will create a new cultural renaissance to celebrate the creativity of our species, just to name a few of the many wonderful things we will be able to do. To discuss these different roads, which offer themselves at this branching point in history, join us in this upcoming conference. So again, that is Saturday, February 4th. It will consist of 2 panels. It will begin at 10 a.m., and we are asking that people pre-register for this conference. We want that conference, and we'll say more about this in the discussion period, to be attended by thousands of people live, and of course for many others to see it. And what we are going to be organizing, and partially this call is also directed toward that, is a network of people that understand how and why it is urgent to deploy this. Now, I'll just indicate quickly one last thing. There are only about 5 personages with some sort of military or military intelligence background that are presently clearly speaking out on the insanity of the present United States war against Russia, because that is the only war that exists, and we're going to, in one sense, begin to move away from allowing it to even to be described as a war with Ukraine. There's no war with Ukraine going on. There's only a war between the United States and NATO with Russia, and that is what this country is now committed to. So Colonel Douglas McGregor, Colonel Richard Black, Scott Ritter, Ray McGovern, and the CIA operative Larry Johnson. Those are really the 5 people that have been saying something. 3 of them are from 4 of them actually from the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, which is an organization that was started back in 2003 to try to prevent the Iraq War from occurring. So that's the real circumstance of what we find ourselves in. That's what we're going to have to we're going to have to change the dynamic in the United States, in which you have voices of this type, many of whom have been at one time or another, in fact, all of them at one time or another have been featured on the Schiller Institute or the LaRouche PAC. But we've got to create a circumstance in which the clarity becomes to people that the United States is on an insane trajectory. It is not merely calculated. That's why people keep coming up blank who say, I can't understand what these people are doing. It's because it doesn't work in the rational world. It is easy to understand if you start from the standpoint that what you are seeing is the self-destruction of a once great nation, which will converge upon thermonuclear holocaust of the planet, if that becomes the only recourse for that nation to take out its self-created enemies, in this case Russia and China. This has been induced through British intelligence, British imperial ambitions, and a British cultural paradigm shift of the United States and of Western culture, which happened in the immediate aftermath of the death of Franklin Roosevelt. That cultural shift is what people refer to as cultural freedom, what they refer to as democracy, what they refer to as the rule of law, what they refer to as international human rights for transgenders, etc. That's what this is. And so the ensemble of this has to be taken into consideration in order to understand how to reverse it. So what we're here to discuss tonight, as some people have heard, if you got our mailing about this, is a topic that was originally titled in an article by Lyndon LaRouche, How Democracy Became Diseased, Freedom versus Democracy. And to discuss that topic and then engage in a dialogue with people about the character and content of that document, we have Gerry Rose. So, Gerry, if you're here, the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much. Well, look, I want to start with the stunning revelations that occurred in the discussion last Saturday. Because the cumulative effect, if one was listening carefully, you realize that with de Gaulle, Adenauer, Kennedy, the Pope, Enrico Mattei, Patrice Lumumba, then Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, there was the potential for a shift, massive potential for a shift away from the Cold War to a joint work with the Soviet Union. I discussed this 2 weeks ago, which was the abiding commitment of both Kennedy and Eisenhower after the death of Franklin Roosevelt. They were part of the obvious potential that Roosevelt had created in the 12 years that he was president. So it didn't just die with Roosevelt. There was a massive fight which broke out again in the 1960s with the leadership, first the leadership of Eisenhower in the 50s, and then later Kennedy, and then King. And then it was around the world with the Bandung Conference in the 50s. So what you had, what the oligarchy was reacting to, was they sensed their doom. That's the reality. And they sense their doom now. Do not forget. Do not give them powers they do not have. They sense their doom. This is desperation on their part. To blow up the Nord Stream pipeline is an act of desperation. Colonel Black developed it in a very interesting way, right? And Helga developed it in another way. So that we are now in that situation. We're a determined leadership within the United States who understands what the actual issues are, which is what we're going to present tonight. And Helga has presented, Dennis presents it quite effectively all the time, right? Diane Sayers presents it. We can win this fight. Don't get bamboozled. The reason they are going crazy is because with the 50-year fight of Lyndon LaRouche and Helga to actually shape the future is now coming into existence. That's the context for this discussion. And it was the detailed, very effective presentations of last Saturday, give you a real sense of both of the desperation, but also, with Dresdner Bank, all these other. I mean, this was a real movement, and this didn't die. Lynn and Helga fought for it, and now the whole developing sector, the global South. So don't get bamboozled by this thing. Now, the question that Lynn raises in this paper, how democracy became diseased, freedom versus democracy, is extreme. I mean, I joked about it this morning when I said this paper could have been written tomorrow. It's that prescient. Not just today, tomorrow. It's that prescient. Now, what does Lynn start with? How democracy became disease? How does he take the issue? He said, look, under Franklin Roosevelt, there was an idea of democracy. which I'm going to develop in a couple of weeks around this question of David Lilienthal, who we have discussed. But Roosevelt created. Remember, all of Europe had gone fascist. Italy, France, Germany. Britain was already fascist. And then, of course, you had communism, which took over the East. The only country based upon an actual idea of republican forms of democracy, and that's a very precise subject, was the United States under Franklin Roosevelt. So Lynn starts with this issue of how did democracy become diseased? Now, what he references, and this is critical, is that the idea of what the disease idea of democracy was developed by H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell, but Wells in particular, in a document called The Open Conspiracy. In other words, the idea was that the idea of science in this open conspiracy, what the scientists were, and this is where Cliff Karakoff's insight into synarchy is critical, is that the scientists would be the men above society, above any nation state, who would determine how to control the limited resources of each of society as a whole. That the so-called science would be the science of how to rationally deploy the so-called limited resources. And that the idea of man, which was deeply embedded in the British Empire, was directly Malthusian. There's a whole history to this. But it comes from this idea that men are evil, irredeemably evil. And therefore, the more of them, you have more evil. It's a Gnostic Bogomil conception. And the core of the open conspiracy is to convince, and that the scientists had to convince, as Bertrand Russell said, that snow was black. That the key to science, which he says later in Science and Civilization, Russell does, the key to science is social control. How can you efficiently dumb down and brainwash the population of the world such that they think these are their alternatives. These are their only alternatives. And this was called fascism with a democratic face. And I think Garland Nixon developed that effectively. But this was synarchy, i.e., you must have social control. It has nothing to do with physical reality. You have to create narratives. That the role of the scientist is mainly social science, to create a narrative to convince people snow is black. Now this came to fruition, and when you hear these guys talk about democracy, you better cringe. In an article that we wrote in 1987 on Project Democracy, it's called the U.S.'s Project Democracy, Another British Creation. Now, this was created by the Trilateral Commission, Project Democracy. And the author, the primary author of Project Democracy, was Samuel P. Huntington. Now, I'm going to read you what he means, or what it's called the Crisis in Democracy, and he wrote it in 1975. And this is the basis when they say that we have to defend our rights and our freedoms against totalitarianism. The Trilateral Commission organized a report run by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was set up in business by David Rockefeller. And they wrote, and now I'm going to read you what Huntington had to say. Huntington wrote that the United States had an excess of democracy. He wrote further that the effective operation of a democratic political system usually requires some measure of apathy and non-involvement on the part of some individuals and groups. This is from the report I'm reading here. Marginal social groups, such as blacks, are now becoming full participants in the political system. Yet the danger of overloading the political system with demands which extend its functions and undermine its authority still remain. We have come to recognize that there are potentially desirable limits to economic growth. There are also potentially desirable limits to the indefinite expansion of democracy. So what was this Project Democracy? And this is where Cliff's insight, where he said it's synarchy. It was the Democratic Party. It was the head of the Democratic, Manat, the head of the Republican Party, I forget his name, the head of the trade unions, Lane Kirkland, the leadership of the Chamber of Commerce, the leadership of labor, and they issued this Project Democracy, which was focused on the idea of no anarchy. That if you allow people to do what they want in the way they wanted, you have to squash anarchy, which is synarchy, or what we call universal fascism. So that the Project Democracy, which later became the National Endowment for Democracy, which was in the center of the destabilization of not only Ukraine, but all the colored revolutions, under the name of democracy. So that when they talk about democracy, what they talk about is the undermining of the nation state that would defend the general welfare, to create a series of individual interest groups that would destabilize any government that would insist on the general welfare and the progress of every individual in that society as a whole. So that was the actual mission of Project Democracy. And it's very beautifully detailed in this report I'm referencing here. Now what Lynn does is he says, well, look, what is this actual history of this thing? Where does this thing come from? This idea of so-called democracy. It comes from what he called the Bogomil cult. in which it is a form of Gnostic good and evil, and that somehow the elect, who are chosen by so-called nobility, are given secret knowledge and power to become the establishment. And what are their rights to run society? They have property titles, which was literally what Adam Smith argued, what Quesnay argued. All these scions, Malthus, of course, argued it. All these scions of the British East India Company argued it was property titles and the defense of property titles that gave the elect their rights, that there was no knowable truth, that you could not actually argue that you could know the truth and therefore could affect the general welfare. So this disease was called fascism with a democratic face, because they were convincing people that they were free. They have the right to do anything. But as we found out, if you have an effective society that can actually affect the general welfare through scientific progress, well, that becomes anathema to the so-called property titles of Wall Street, of London, of these Mickey Mouse, right? Now, the question of true freedom, Lynn raises it from the standpoint of think of freedom as from a physical economic standpoint of what is called free energy. That free energy represents in the real universe freedom. Now, what does that mean, free energy? It's the discovery of universal physical principle, the discovery and the deployment of universal physical principles, new universal physical principles that are discovered in the sovereign precinct of each individual mind, that the discovery, the aha moment, the discovery is a proprietary individual act by which the discoverer will overthrow the previously existing axiomatic structure, because they recognize that there is a higher hypothesis. That higher hypothesis, which is generated by the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis, that higher hypothesis is the basis for the human species to reproduce itself on an increasingly higher level, and increasing what Lynn, a critical discovery of Lynn, called relative potential population density. That truth is, or natural law, truth, is not a series of facts, but a series of discoveries that increase the relative potential population density of the planet. And you need freedom to not just merely discover it, but to promulgate it in society. Because it will tend to overthrow the existing establishment and academic communities. Their freedom is essential for discovery and the deployment of that discovery, because it will tend to overthrow every axiomatic basis for the previous system. So freedom is necessary, but only if it's circumscribed by the fight and the passion to give mankind a future, both in the social realm, in terms of the classical art, and the capability of understanding and deploying new forms of social organization, which Helga has been, and Lynn have been critical in the discovery of that. This is counterposed to what Lynn describes in this as the underlings. In other words, what the follow-on to the Bogomil Gnostic religions was the Roman Empire. And of course, Shakespeare has this unbelievable insight, which I wrote a longer article on, in which Lynn, in this piece, quotes the famous Cassius, saying, "The fault, dear Brutus, lies not in the stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings." Because this idea of going along to get along, this idea of stay low, keep below the surface, you'll get the benefits of society. When in fact, if you don't have discovery, if you don't have a Republican citizenry, that in fact you will always have collapses of civilization, not sometimes, always. And as we discuss in the first class discussion here, it was the genius of Joan of Arc. It was the genius of Louis XI. It was the genius of Franklin Roosevelt. And I can go on and on and on. Or the Renaissance is a more clear example of this. So that the worst folly is to create a citizenry that believes they are underlings. Or Lynn has this beautiful formulation. Let's not call them populists. Let's call them by their proper scientific name, underlings. Now, what kind of society do you have to promulgate in order such that the individual citizen becomes a critical adjunct, both in the discovery and the deployment? Now, discovery doesn't mean you have to individually discover every single thing. You don't. But you can rediscover it. That the purpose of education in Republican forms of government is that people rediscover the critical turning points for themselves in the sovereign precincts of their own mind, so that change and higher order change and higher order change they become accustomed to as a way of thinking. That science is the promulgation of the creative capacity of each individual citizen, and that your education system is premised on the rediscovery. And anyone who lived with Lyndon LaRouche knows he insisted that you rediscover it. If you regurgitated to him what he said, you heard about it, okay? You heard about it. Well, you didn't go very far. Right? So that what Lynn says, and we discussed this in the Jesus and Civilization piece, what Lynn says is that the quality of actual leadership is based upon the idea of imago Dei. And taking that idea into your gut, or owning it, as he says, is when you take that idea into your gut and you have lived through the process of discovery, and you realize how important every individual on this planet is, and you've made a commitment to that idea of man and that idea of each individual man, whether everybody lives up to it or not, it's a commitment, as he references the Martin Luther King famous speech on the mountaintop. That leadership in society is to go against popular opinion on the basis of scientific discovery that will indeed put mankind forward in the form of a national, a nation state. And this could have very different forms, because the different cultures make their discoveries in slightly different ways. So therefore, it's not the form, but it's the commitment. As in China, they call it the shared future of mankind. In Russia, they have a different way of discussing it. And they have some of the best, and Vernadsky said it best. So that what we are unleashing now is the crushing of that irrationality called democracy, that issues from the Bogomils through the Roman Empire, through of course the British empires in general, and the enormous potential that we have right now on this planet to change the course of history based upon this flowering that Lynn, Helga, and others have created as the basis for the next paradigm, the great shift away from this insanity that they call democracy. So that's what I wanted to start with.
Okay, Gerry, very good. So I think we'll go right now to the queue. They open that up. Press *6 to get in the queue to ask a question. And so let me say a couple of things such that people know are happening. Well, first of all, something which I think is important just to have as a sense of the condition under which we are having this discussion. Because what we're doing is we are bringing you into a kind of discussion that Lyndon LaRouche and others used to have with us back in the 1970s. There's a discussion about what's called epistemology. How do you know anything? How can you know the truth? That is, how can you know anything? And this is important because the kind of problem that is occurring in the discussion processes globally is that rational people are finding that the normal way that they think that society is organized, and they think that discussions happen among such people, is being violated. So, for example, Douglas McGregor, in a discussion with Andrew Napolitano, keeps running into this disconnect. So, for example, he has various sources on the ground in Ukraine. And according to his sources, Ukrainian army has about 122,000 dead people. And basically, Russia's dead are running at about 20,000, 16 to 20,000. In other words, about 6 for every Russian soldier killed, there have been 6 Ukrainians killed. Now, in case nobody didn't notice this, the population of Russia is well over 200 million. The population of Ukraine was at 40 million approximately before, as the war started. About 8 million people have left the country. So what you're talking about is a society which is not going to hold together. But and so as McGregor looks at it, he says Ukraine has actually breached the limits of its capability, and Russia is just getting started. If you look at all of the talk coming from the transatlantic about what they're going to do, none of what they're talking about that they're going to do can possibly defeat Russia. But now the problem that has come up, which is what Judge Napolitano posed to McGregor is, well, since the transatlantic world is now saying Ukraine must win, and Ukraine is saying winning means taking not merely Donbass and Lugansk back and Zaporozhye, but also regaining Crimea, which was part of Russia since at least the time of Catherine the Great, with the exception of the few years during which Nikita Khrushchev, who was from Ukraine, gave Ukraine to gave Crimea, to Ukraine, which was a few decades. So this means that there's no and Ukraine has said there's no way that they will consider negotiating so long as Putin is in power. See, that mad statements from Ukraine, or what purports to be Ukraine. Now, Russia is making it clear that from their standpoint, they, because they are talking about denazification, will not accept, at least in principle, will not accept Zelensky as a negotiating partner. And of course, the media, transatlantic media, has made Zelensky, equivalent to some sort of MacArthur or something. And so if he were in fact deposed, unless he actually simply left on his own, or he was deposed by people in Ukraine, of course, then there would seem to be no way out of any of this, except a nuclear confrontation. Well, wait a minute. Actually, the truth is, as I believe McGregor points out, but it is that, as he put it, we own the Ukrainian state. It's not independent. It's presently the 51st state. So they will do what we tell them. Now, of course, the problem with that being the case is, in order for that to then just come out and be revealed, all of a sudden, you're showing the game. It's important, therefore, to understand our role, because our role is that in this circumstance, what we're going to do is we're going to insist to people there is no way out of this. We have people in the queue. We're going to go to that, except there is a way out, and that is to think creatively outside of all of these confines and outside of this definition of democracy. I'm glad that Gerry went through what he went through, especially about Samuel Huntington. because that was the crisis. Too much democracy. You let a lot of black people start demanding things that they actually need that we can't have, because now you're interfering in the deliberative process, in the actual day-to-day functioning and governing of the society. Can't have that. Okay, so we're going to go to the queue. Let's have the first person. Okay, are you able to hear me?
Hi, Dennis. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Dennis. Hi, Gerry.
Hi.
This is Chris in Panama. Gerry, just have a question. Just need some clarification based on two things you mentioned. Well, I need clarification on a few other things, but I'll start with these two. During your conversation about freedom and energy, you mentioned a higher hypothesis. Can you please explain that? And then, when you talked about education and rediscovery, can you give an example as what an adult?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, hold on.
That's what Lyndon. Believe me, we drilled on that. Yeah. Right.
1 second, Gerry. Yeah, two examples. One for an adult and one for a child. Examples of rediscovery. Good exercises for rediscovery for an adult and one for a child.
Sure. Okay. Let me get to the first one. The hypothesis is a higher hypothesis. In other words, there is a lawfulness to the universe as a whole because it was created. That lawfulness is constantly evolving. That the creator is constantly creating. When they looked into the telescope, the Webb telescope, as much as they were excited about the Hubble, the Webb was much bigger, gave much more. You're looking at things that happened 10 billion years ago. They had no idea what they were looking at. None. But that's what's out there. So the creator is constantly creating. Therefore, if you have a higher hypothesis, the discovery of an actual universal physical principle, like Einstein said, what they call crucial experiment. Einstein knew, as does every scientist. In fact, Einstein once said, I want to know what God thinks. Because there is a constant process of creation, both in the creator and the discovery of that creation by the human cognitive capacities. And each discovery lays the basis for the next discovery. So therefore, that is the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis, is the process of creation in the universe itself by the creator. Now, every Aristotelian would say that's impossible. If it was perfect from the very beginning, why would you need anything changing? And if you say it wasn't perfect from the very beginning, then God was not perfect, which is an absurdity. God is the process of creation. It's a process, it's not a thing. And therefore the Big Bang is absurd. All these other things are absurd. And the Kuza and Helga's insistence on the idea of the coincidence of opposites, I went through that in the Jesus and Civilization, which I'm not going to go through again. But on the level of the senses and the level of the universe itself, the absolute maximum is the absolute minimum. So it would seem it's a coincidence of opposites. It would seem that way to the senses. So I'm posing to you, that's an adult discovery you have to make, okay? For a child, one of the nicest discoveries, which was actually the basis, or a lot of the basis for the revolution that was called the Humboldt system of education, was discovering a new society, one from which your society in the West issued from, and that was the Iliad, and the reading of the Iliad by young children in the ancient Greek, so that they relive the experience of a society that was the basis for their society. And by working through the kinds of discoveries that Homer made, which was the basis for all Greek civilization and later Western civilization, including the discoveries of Plato, really Socrates and Plato, which is the very basis for progress for mankind. A child can rediscover and relive the experience, and with a proper education would be delighted with discovering all these qualities of these heroes, and it's quite something. So those are that's sort of an answer. There's more to it, a lot more to it, but that's sort of an answer.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and just before we go to the next person, we just add the following. If you take the situation that McGregor and Napolitano are posed with, a higher hypothesis actually has to come about, right? That is, it would seem that there's no way out. It's an existential situation for Russia, and it's been defined by NATO as an existential situation for NATO. Okay, so that means that neither side can lose, but both sides can't win. Well, what's the higher hypothesis here? Now, you better discover it, because otherwise you're going to end up in nuclear war, whatever anyone is saying on either side. Now, we've proposed a higher hypothesis. That's in the 10 principles that Helga has put forward. And specifically that a process of negotiation happens, which is based on the Treaty of Westphalia, that would happen perhaps at the Vatican, or it might merely be initiated by the Vatican to occur at a completely different location. And that's, of course, what we are inviting people to sign on to. So there's a proposed higher hypothesis to this whole situation. Now, here's the idea that's needed. That's not the only situation like that. There are many other circumstances like that that will continually come up. And the reason is the faulty reasoning, if you want to call it that, of these people will reproduce this with respect to China or any other location because it's geopolitical. Geopolitics itself of any type will yield this kind of insoluble paradox under many other circumstances. And in many of those other circumstances, as in this one, you will end up on the doorstep of thermonuclear war. So now, therefore, that means you've got to hypothesize an entirely different way of looking at these circumstances without being able to consider how in all circumstances this can be violated, this can be overcome, this can be superseded, then you don't have any possibility of durable survival. Now, that's just an epistemological application of what Gerry was talking about. It's a higher principle. He already described that. But there is a way in which that's directly apprehensible and required, and it was required in diplomacy. That's why Cuza was such an effective diplomat. He was the central person that reorganized many of the relations among states. That's why he would do it.
That's good. That's right.
So just so people understand, that's how these things work, okay? So but we're on it because Helga has been on this specific thing since the late 70s, early 80s. And it's been discussed with people in the Vatican and that kind of thing by her. And the organization has a certain grasp of this, but we're also making it available to everybody that's out there that's working with us. And so that's just something else to put in. Okay? Okay, great. Thanks for that. Okay, let's go to the next caller. All right, are you able to hear me?
Yes, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so this is Jose Vega here in New York, and I really appreciate this discussion going on because I've had arguments and discussions and debates about this very topic too. And I'd like to present to you something that somebody told me. So I was telling them about the higher hypothesis. We were having a discussion on Plato and Socrates. And I told them that it's possible to create the circumstances where a culture is almost self-propitiating, where every generation of people is making things better. And what he said was, actually no, because if you think about it, the only way humanity has ever progressed is through tension and problems and evil, and in the overcoming of evil. And he said you could actually argue that you require evil, that evil is a necessity in order for humanity to grow, because otherwise it wouldn't have a reason to figure out a diplomatic solution of what's going on with NATO and the United States. And I asked him, well, then does this mean that we are forever doomed to just have evil versus good? And he said, well, yeah, I mean, that's what Joseph Campbell was all about. And he said he happened to be right. And he said the only way your theory, he was referring to me, can work is if you have this, as you put it, tension, but it is required always. Otherwise, people just never have a reason to grow. And so I want to pose this question to you. One, do you think that's true or not? And also, can you actually have growth in a society, a productive tension, rather than everybody being threatened to be blown up every 10 years?
I think you know the answer to that one. Yeah, sure. Yeah, this is St. Augustine, because he lived in the Roman Empire. I mean, there is such a thing as evil, but it doesn't exist in and of itself. It's a reaction to the good. That's the truth. That's the reality of it. You see, you don't have to brief an oligarch to hate somebody beautiful. You don't have to brief them. It's a visceral. They're miserable creatures. That's the truth. Whatever they own or think they own, or their absurd ideas, they can never create. Because they hate the idea of mankind and the progress of mankind. Not every single oligarch, but as a species, they hate it. And therefore, they lack, or they have destroyed themselves to the point that they almost have no soul. Implicitly, they could repent. You hold that out to the last minute, but they would have to absolutely. And there's a very famous, actually, a very beautiful novel, which has this as the theme. It's called L'Esposa, which is an Italian novel. It's just beautiful. It's called The Wedding. But it's just a beautiful novel about this issue here. But the truth of the matter is that evil is a reaction, or as Helga says in her 10th principle, it's the lack of good. It's the lack of development. Because as a species, we have demonstrated, because of our quality as a species, we are driven by the good, by or what we call genius is an application of the good. and a necessary application of the good. You see the pathetic nature of mankind. You see what they do to each other. You see the kinds of degradation that they're put through. They can't eat. They don't have hospitals. They don't have water. They don't have anything. Well, if you turn your back on that, if you don't give a damn about that, well, then you're practically dead. You know, that's what King said in the most powerful and beautiful way. You could die long before your physical body goes. So this quality of mind, this quality that Kennedy touched, that King touched, that Robert Kennedy touched, but, you know, of course there were others in history. We just know these people. People were prepared, as Franklin Roosevelt touched them. They were going to defend mankind from the synarchy, from the kind of insanity. And they gave, as in Lincoln, who was a poet, people gave the last full measure of devotion. This is what we live for as a species. We don't need evil at all. Because as a species, we want the best for everyone, and each of us for everyone. That's what we are as a species. That's why the Peace of Westphalia was so important, and it worked for a while. We have to unleash that capacity to discover the joy of discovery. Not because you're made to, although sometimes you are made to, but because look at Kraft Erica. His whole extraterrestrial imperative. That's our nature. That truly is our nature, which is why the oligarchs hate us. And that's what Lynn and Helga and we represent as a leading edge for mankind. That's who we are. That's what we are. You know that quite well. That's what you said at your conference presentation at the youth conference. You know what that is. So that's reality.
We had a couple things here. Just do it quickly, and these are all things for people to think about. Evil is the expression of the pre-existence of free choice. Evil is the expression of the pre-existence of free choice, because check this out. You would not, if you only did what was good that was done naturally without any choice as to being able to do the opposite, you wouldn't be free. There would be no free choice. Animals do that.
Sure.
Animals do everything by instinct. So there's not the fact that a cat will go bag a bird is not, and then a hawk will bag a cat. Okay? You know, there's no evil in it. This is what they do. Matter of fact, if they weren't doing it, they would not be true to their nature. Right? So, but they don't then, you don't have it like in the environmentalist cartoons where you got some bear and he makes some decision not to eat somebody or whatever, right? As several people have found, the North Pole,
that ain't the case.
Locations, right? Or even in New Jersey and so on, right? So the bear is going to do what the bear does. That's the bear thing, okay? So on the occasion you get a courageous cat will go after the bear, and it will seem to violate nature, but the domestic cat will defend you or defend its brood on occasion, and sometimes the cat gets away with it because the bear is just, bamboozled. But, in other words, the point of the fact is that the expressions of pre-existence of choice, free choice of the will, is only possible if something which is other than the species nature of mankind can be posed as an option. That's what that is. No. What is necessary for progress is what people call finitude, limits, what people often call even mortality, although that's a little different. That's a little different, okay? But the fact that you, for example, take this. Now, obviously, actually, I think that medical science, as I think Gerry agrees, is generally, we are being stupid as a human race. Clearly, people should be able to live for hundreds of years, and if we were actually putting our heads together on this instead of trying to kill each other, we probably could have already done that. But we still would have been born. So we are not eternal beings and never would be. No matter how long you would live, and it might be advisable, since it would take you like 100,000 light years to go across this, this largest galaxy that we found, which is like 100,000 light years across. So like even if you were moving at the speed of light, it'd take you 100,000 years. Obviously, either we've solved the problem of relativistic travel, and we also do something about human longevity. So that's not what I'm talking about. Obviously, we should try to do that. But there is a beginning and there is an end. Yeah. Now, we know this, and it's true of all things. So limits tell us boundaries. We know how to go beyond boundaries. Without the boundaries, we wouldn't know that. Edgar Poe discusses that in his essay, Eureka, something that people might want to just take a look at. And I just wrote this in not because, we want to, but we're trying to get everyone thinking about what the 10 principles are and what our organization's really up to. We're trying to get these ideas directly into the day-to-day discussion because we know that the reason for the suicides in America and the reason for a lot of the homicides is because this fundamental question of the nature of life itself and the meaning of life is the one that we got to address with the American people. We got to address it in some way that has direct physical, economic, and strategic application, thus giving them the opportunity to actually, change the direction of the country and change their own lives. So that's how you do it. So there's no reason for the other argument is simply satanic. It's the usual thing. Oh, you got to have evil because of blah blah, which is a way of basically in a cowardly way copping out of taking arms against the sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. Yeah. So it's a Hamlet idea. Okay. Okay. Great. Okay. So we'll go to the next person. Okay. Are you able to hear us? We have somebody else, right? Can you hear us?
Yes. Hello. This is Harrison L. Frank from New Jersey. Some thoughts on what Gerry Rose brought out in today's fireside chat has been an ongoing process of what I have been going through since my teenage years, when I truly became politically aware through a series of events in 2005, when I really began to question, for lack of a better word, mainstream American politics, which eventually culminated in coming into the LaRouche movement. As I often discuss with friends, both within and without the movement, there is certainly a crisis of not just Western governance, not just the Western economy, although they are all part of the larger picture. There is also a moral crisis and an epistemological crisis. If that is not resolved, it will destroy humanity. It will take the other civilizations, the Chinese, the Russians, the Indians, down with the West. This is why I understand that a process of negotiations in the Vatican between the Russians and the Ukrainians is a necessary first step. If we were to expand it further, then it could potentially evolve into a second Florence Council, possibly between the Roman Catholic Church and the Russian Orthodox Church. Those are some possibilities that I have been playing around in my mind. Another element is, where do we go from there? Obviously, in the process, the old liberal order has to be, quite frankly, thrown into the trash heap. But what must arise from it, though? As Helga mentioned in the Hitler book, in her Hitler book, we have to be careful not to submit ourselves to some of the more irrational ideologies and systems, but rather think of a new paradigm, if I can use that term, that would basically be universal to all of humanity. A reestablishment of the Westphalian principles of the nation state, away from what Tony Blair declared in the late 90s, and then work from there. From that, you can have various projects that all nations are in collaboration or in concert on, like the World Health Platform, Operation Ibn Sina, which could be part of it. The development of new infrastructure platforms, like the high-speed rail systems and the World Land Bridge, or you can even go beyond that with the talk of these vacuum trains that could potentially go 14,000, or they could reach max speeds of 14,000 miles per hour. And with that, a potential, working from earlier arrangements, a potential to bring all the nations together on such projects, as well as the extraterrestrial imperative and the technical nuts and bolts that would go into it, along with the new understanding of human organization, could be one way of creating this world to come. However, the difficult part is in the Western populations, particularly in the American populations, where there is intense brainwashing from not just propaganda, but I suspect and you guys can add in on, you guys can fill into that, but also a campaign of subliminal messaging and brainwashing, outright brainwashing, possibly of psychic proportions, going with the MK Ultra and Operation Mockingbird and the sex, drugs, rock and roll counterculture, which renders the population unable to think of a higher conception. Even so, in a way, they have to be.
Well, yeah, Harry, let me just we got to get a lot more subjective. You're right in what you're saying, but we have to get a lot more subjective. It's a question of leadership.
Yeah.
It comes down to a principle of leadership, which our movement represents. In other words, we know what to do, but how do we? Dennis is putting it in a very good way. Right now, we have an insoluble paradox, or what would seem to be an insoluble paradox, a life and death situation, right? And this fight to reestablish the idea of man as creator, as a creative individual, to discover the necessary both forms of social organization and scientific discoveries like fusion and others, which are quite singular. But you need leadership. And this quality of this passion of Jesus Christ, not just the mission, but the passion to risk everything for mankind, as King did, as Kennedy did, as Helga does, as Diane does, as others do. You're part of that. We've got to get a young generation with a sense of mission and passion, because we have to create the future now. The Vatican's not going to lead a Renaissance. Forget it. Nobody but us. But that is the work of generations. But what you have now, and this is where we have to be very clear, Lynn and Helga, the cumulative effect of their work and our work over decades has created a leadership in Russia, a leadership in China, a leadership that resonates throughout the world. And they may not even know us, well, know Lynn, but there is a real leadership that is prepared to fight. And our fight is in this country, to link up with these other countries to actually create, to be honest with you, to crush these evil bastards. They need to be crushed. And we know how to do it. And that's our fight. That's what Diane represents so well. And you do too, Hannah. You do a good job at that. Others do. And we just got to keep flanking and hitting and moving. We've got to get out of this mess. Dennis posed the paradox very well. And I think that's what we got to keep on working on.
I will consider it.
Thank you.
Okay, very good. Very good. I'm not sure. Let me see. Do we have someone else there? I believe we do. Let's try something. Okay. Are you able to hear us? Maybe I'm wrong about that. Can't quite tell.
Hi, this is Issa in Los Angeles.
Great. Very good. Hi. Go ahead.
I had to revise my question a little bit because it was touched on previously, which is nice because I feel this discussion is progressing in a really interesting fashion. I wanted to talk more about this process of creating genius rather than it being innate. And that being said, what level of discipline and rigor is required for any one individual to develop their mind in a way that allows them to achieve the level of greatness capable of creating a real cultural renaissance? And secondly, why everyone should be excited about that process rather than intimidated
yeah, right.
by it. So,
good question. That's an excellent question. That is really good. Oh, man. Okay, well, Lynn developed two generations in the Labor Committee. The first generation is what you would call the boomers, right? And then a generation after that. And it was one of the most rigorous processes in history of any institution. Why? because he was arguably the greatest genius who ever lived. And you can imagine what it was like trying to keep up with him, right? And he was constantly generating new hypotheses which you had to research and develop. And different people just went off, their different talents, took them in other directions. Some went to music. I went to history and tragedy, or not tragedy, but drama, right? But he was constantly generating the necessary next hypothesis, which you had to solve. Where do you think all this intelligence came from about Project Democracy? Lynn knew damn well what we were up against. And as he was fed more, he was able to generate more hypotheses, and others followed it through, and that's where these reports came from. So that the process of discovery and generation are always essential. So that now why is that the true a true joy? Well, when you finally do make a breakthrough, when I could describe it, I'll just describe it personally, and others would have a different way of describing it. But it's like the world stands still and the whole world makes sense. I have the quality. I don't know. Dennis could describe it differently. I don't know, but it's like the whole world makes sense, and everything in it makes sense when you make those kinds of discoveries, and you can generate other discoveries based upon that discovery and where it goes. And it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work, and it takes good work habits. And we did, and ironically, we did this under the most intense wartime conditions. I mean, the FBI was out to get us, and everyone else was out to get Lynn. Right? So it wasn't like we had leisure. But we knew what we had done. We changed the course of history. Russia, China, certain capabilities within the United States. We changed the course of history. We now are the preponderant power on this planet. That doesn't mean we're not in terrible danger. Because we are that power, we are in that danger. But know who you are, know what you're part of, and then, work at the kinds of talent you have, which can be discussed and effectively deployed for all of mankind. That's the best I can do for you.
Okay, I think we have a couple more people in the queue, so I think we'll go right to those people. I will just say, just in my own thinking about this, not about my own case. I was talking to someone today, became active around the whole 9/11 process, and what she described is that she was moved to get involved because of the people that had to jump from the top of the building and the choices that they had to make.
Yeah, right.
Some of you know the picture of the falling man. And she said to me, after I saw that, and I thought about the choices they had to make, I thought about the choice I had to make.
Yeah.
Now that is interesting for three reasons. She doesn't know any of those people. She doesn't know the falling man. But if she does, she decided that she'd stand in the place of the falling man, that so long as that crime is not brought into the light of justice and of truth, that person is fallen. They didn't hit the ground because they are the metaphor for what has happened to her nation. Now, if that becomes the passion inside of oneself, any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind becomes a real, no longer a line of poetry. It's a expression of a truth that has been embraced by that individual. That is the beginning of genius. Because now what you've done is you've identified with the species, by identified with the stranger, by the unknown stranger who falls forever unless you rise. Your intelligence has to rise. The intelligence of the people around you has to rise. You move from being an underling, as Gerry described it before, to being a participant and actor in history. That is the precondition to being able to aspire to a characteristic of genius. And in the case of Lyndon LaRouche, that was the thing that was more prevalent in a unique way than any other characteristic he had. His full, passionate identification with mankind and the falling, the fallen and the falling, as he identified in India when he was there as a young man, and as he identified in everything that he proposed in the way of economic policy as well as in education. Lynn believed that everybody was capable of doing exactly what he did, and that nobody was capable of doing it if he weren't doing it. So that's the standpoint from which then you proceed, and people will do that with greater or lesser degrees of perfection and in different ways that they approach it. Okay, so let's go to the next person. Okay, are you able to hear us? Hello?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can, sure.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, hi, this is Kynan from Queens. I got on a little late, but I was able to listen to the discussion, and it actually prompted me to go back to a slug that was written, I think it was last week's briefing, and it contained, actually, it was a segment of a discussion that Lynn had with the intelligence sector in 1995. And the subject of it was, how do you do intelligence, right? And I think it relates a lot with this idea with the coincidence of opposites. And I'll just, read it quickly. It's not too much. But he actually said that all intelligence work is premised on the method of Plato, that is, the method of change, epitomized by the problem posed in the Parmenides dialogue. You are searching for something which has no name. No name you're going to put in the computer defines it. All intelligence is created work in the sense of the one-many relationship described by Plato in the Parmenides dialogue. You're going to discover a one whose name you do not know, and therefore you can never put the name in the computer. How do you define an incommensurable? You take at least two or more values which are not the incommensurable, and you try to box in the area where the incommensurable lives, which consists of everything you know about the area defined. The area among a set of values, not on a set of values. You cannot triangulate the precise position of the value you're looking for. If you can, you're doing the wrong thing. You must define an area of knowledge in which you are going to search to define the existence of what you're looking for in terms of the conditions in the area of knowledge put under scrutiny. So what you're actually doing is you're creating a many from everything you have available, plus what you can think of. You're looking at that many, and you're trying to solve the one many problem. That is intelligence work. And I just wanted your thoughts on that, Gerry, because I think it relates a lot.
Yeah.
It relates a lot. Yeah. It goes
true.
back
It's
to
true.
the question of the coincidence of opposites, and what you were saying about getting above what's posed, what's posed in terms of the battlefield, if they're going to win it there, but you need to go to a higher negotiating platform, a higher hypothesis. And I think that's what he's challenging his people on when he's discussing intelligence work. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
He always did that. Yeah. You see, the more you understand the one as you work on it, Cusa is the best in history on that question. Okay? The more capable you are of getting at the truth and the way you will order it. You see, the mind measures and harmonizes. That's what the mind does. It measures, it harmonizes, and discovers new measure and new harmony. Because the universe itself is evolving. So you can look, and that's why I was so excited when Helga put the 10 principles. Dennis will tell you, I called him. And he said, look, I want to do a 3-part series on this. Right? Because she had generated a unique discovery at something she was working at for 2 to 3 years. And it just clicked. And that was, you know what I mean? And that's an example of the discovery of the higher process. And if you look at it, it's not a program. It's a set of epistemological insights which ends with man is good. This is a big fight in civilization, because a lot of these fundamentalist religions said man is irredeemably evil, and they really mean it. I mean, they're not just saying that, and that by grace of God, some unique principle So that's, I think, a tremendous example of the kind of breakthroughs that you can make. But like Dennis said, I thought that was very poetic and very beautiful. Helga has mankind in her gut. What does mankind need? Lynn said that all. What does mankind need of me? And that's what I must do. So yeah, I think that's a very useful, putting that in is very useful.
Yeah, that idea also about the mind being measurement. I mean, that's what the word means, M-E-N-S, it's a Latin word. The same word is for measure. That's exactly the idea. Mind is a measurement. All right. I believe there's one other person in the queue. Is that right? I'm hoping that is the case. I think that might be Bill Ferguson. Can you hear us? I'm hoping he's there.
Hello.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, I hope I'm there too.
Yeah, you are.
Yeah, okay.
Gerry, you might recall an earlier discussion early today
I knew that.
about
yes, I do.
the real subject from my standpoint had been raised by some of the organizers about how to effectively move people to act on this threat of nuclear war. And I think it was Kevin organizing in Texas. He said that at a certain point he realized that they were scaring people. You know, they weren't really motivating them. Does that sound accurate from what
Absolutely,
you heard?
yeah, absolutely accurate.
Yeah.
Absolutely accurate.
And I mean, in my mind, it provoked a discussion on how would you, or the idea of how would you overcome that. And my default generally is to try to use humor as one method of doing that. Although, anyway, so we started brainstorming ideas about jokes and signs. Like the one idea that I really stuck in my mind was World War III, no tanks.
I like that one.
Yeah, so I mean,
or do the CO2 one.
The CO2 one. That needs work.
Oh, okay.
I mean, these characters. I mean, I'll just say these characters. They're terrified of CO2 and they're terrified of Russian gas, but they don't seem to have a problem with cyanide gas.
Well, Zyklon B is what.
Zyklon B, yeah, Zyklon B. I don't even know if people know what that is, but
well, it's the gas they use.
That's the brand name. Yeah, the brand name that they used in Nazi Germany. Yeah, and well, anyway.
That's good. I like it. I like it.
Okay, well.
Yeah, no. Look. I mean, we all have our different. Yeah, we have different talents.
Before you get into the humor issue, though, the real issue is that I was raising, and you can come back to that, but is the issue of the fear that you're overcoming. And this has become more and more, I don't know what it is. Maybe I'm getting old or something, but the kind of interventions that Jose and Kynan and Diane set off, I thought it was great. Yeah. I thought it was great that Medea Benjamin got in on the act last week.
Yeah,
going after Congressman Adam Smith.
She was inspired. Yeah, she was inspired by what we did. There's no question about it.
Yeah,
she was inspired. That's what we do.
Yeah.
In other words, the key for us is a quality that Lynn used to call hubris. But hubris not in the sense of the stupid Greek, arbitrary, overcoming everything, but this idea that, as Franklin Roosevelt said, you have nothing to fear so much as fear itself. We do know what to do. And we know what's behind this stuff. And as I said, because this comes up in different guises, we constantly, somebody said, well, what do you do about this? What do you do about that? Be a genius. Come up with a flank. Keep thinking it through, like what Kevin did, right? Constantly think it through. There is a solution to it. But you constantly have to think it through. There's no formula for it. And that's what the social process of the labor committees is, to keep us on the top of our capacities. And that, without Lynn, I mean, as I said, I'm very proud of people. I really am. I think Lynn would be very happy. We just got to keep doing more of it. That's all. And recruit a new generation.
Well, since we have Bill on, I have something I want to pose to both you and him, going back to what Kynan raised, because I think it might be useful for us. to tell to people, because this issue of how you come up with a higher hypothesis and what we mean by that, which is different than a program, different than a slogan, but it has, in the case of making a joke, it's the same idea. When Lynn says this thing, how you define an incommensurable, you take at least two or more values which are not the incommensurable, and you try to box in the area where the incommensurable lives, which consists of everything you know about the area defined. The area among a set of values, not on a set of values. You cannot triangulate the precise position of the value you're looking for. If you can, you're doing the wrong thing. Now, of course, right in there is the fundamental fallacy of digital knowledge, artificial intelligence, statistics, and mathematics. That is what defines it. Now, and here's the interesting thing. Take the Shakespeare sonnets. This is something that both of you guys, think about this. What you're getting in these sonnets is that Shakespeare is going to end, it's 14 lines, you're going to have 3 sets of 4, and then the last 2, which is a single couplet.
Right.
Now, a lot of people try to talk about it being, it's the answer to the Aristotelian syllogism. Well, maybe, but that's not what the hell. I mean, Shakespeare's not.
Shakespeare. You get it.
What the fuck? He doesn't care. He's doing his thing where he's taking these 4s and 4 and 4, and he has this 3-part, right, discussion coming to the one, which is 2 lines, and always causes a reflection on the whole process. But again, right, and the metaphor is continually, and it is not defining a particular solution, but it is it's a unique solution to certain problems being posed. But then he does it again. Then he does it again and again and again, so that you've got this idea of degrees of freedom as you go through. Not meaning that each sonnet represents per se a new degree of freedom, though that might not be wrong. But I just wondered, and I particularly wanted, Bill, for you to say a few things about it because you did so much work on them, because this issue of it's the same thing we try to describe about tuning, that we are not saying when we say C equals 256, that means that there's a relationship between the C, the middle C at that many hertz, and the process related, like when we say A is at 432, but it can be 430, it can be 434. It's a range. It's not a precise number. It's an area. So I just wanted to see if either one of you guys had some reflections on this, because I think the study of these sonnets, and more importantly, the enjoying of the sonnets, just like finding something in there that speaks to people that they, memorize and try to recite and try to get the meaning to come out in what they talk about. So whichever one of you would say something about that.
Yeah, Bill, why don't you take a shot at that?
Oh, no, you, Professor. Well, I don't know. I have to admit the ones that really affected me the most are the ones that are just about death, or we're overcoming the death issue. And I was going to mention that also in terms of, like when you want to talk about coincidence of opposites, I figure life and death, those are some opposites.
Sure. Temporal eternity, yeah.
And, yeah. Right. Like, it just, the sonnet, that time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow
why don't you just do it? Why
or none.
Yeah.
Well, I was starting, but okay. That time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves or none or few to hang upon the boughs that shake against the cold, bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. In me thou seest the twilight of such day as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away, death's second self that seals up all in rest. In me thou seest the glowing of such fire that on the ashes of his youth doth lie, as the deathbed whereon it must expire, consumed with that which it was nourished by. This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well which thou must leave ere long.
Well done.
Well, the one that comes after, you sort of have to complete the thought. But I guess I've worked on that a lot because I've had lots of occasion to feel moved to recite it, like when my parents and grandparents passed away, and numerous friends and other relatives. Because, I mean, I guess that's a central issue. You know, how do you overcome that coincidence of opposites? I mean, Schiller obviously addresses that. For people who've studied it, are familiar with, the idea of the sublime. Mankind is freedom. Without freedom, we're not man. We're not human. But there's the physical limitation of death, and that is a restriction that you cannot overcome physically. But you can overcome it ideally in that you accept that you're going to die and that your life is about, you're transcending, I don't know if this is getting me across, but you're transcending that limitation. You're transcending that limitation because the meaning of your life, you define the meaning of your life as accomplishing something that lives on after that, so that the meaning of your life is actually immortal. I mean, that's kind of a...
No, it's right. It's right, and it's to the point. And I think that's a really wonderful way of... What do you think, Dennis? I think that's a wonderful way of just wrapping this up. Very good discussion.
That's exactly right.
Very deep, very good. Appreciate it.
And that's why I was just thinking about it, because when I go into a crowded room and I'm going to tell a congressman to stop supporting nuclear war, when you describe it, it doesn't sound that hard, but there's a tension. But that somebody else is talking about tension, right? Because we're conditioned not to do that sort of thing. I mean, maybe some people enjoy it. By my upbringing, I'm generally not inclined to be rude and loud, and you might be surprised to hear that. But anyway, it came up in the intervention that we did on Elizabeth Warren. But it has to be done.
Very effective.
There should be thousands of people doing that. These Congress people should not be allowed to walk the street without being confronted on that. They're absolutely insane. They've supported this. And anyway, I think that's the issue. That was partly what we were trying to address with the Dona Nobis Pacem. To get in that zone you were talking about, something that you can't describe.
Yes.
But you can know from the experience of from someone who knows it.
Yes, that's what Lynn talks about as the idea of an idea, that the idea is not directly communicable in that way, that it is, but not in, but through the mind of the other. That's exactly what the poetry does. That's exactly why it is the greatest weapon. That in humor, these things are the greatest weapon against the insanity, which has the power of a logic. Like the Huntington's thing, well, the crisis of democracy is that too many black people that want to actually be free. Can't have that. So what we got to do is cut that out, and go back to what we know, which is how society should be governed. Their theory being, you have elections because you got to give people the semblance of the idea that they are choosing something. But then we all know there's real government. And you can't have the messy process of these people interfering in the actual governing process. That's not for them. They can elect the people that will govern, but they must not govern.
Right.
And so the notion of going into the street, for example, and changing the policy of the government on funding Ukraine, that money should be stopped instantly to stop the danger of thermonuclear war, which is what Medea Benjamin decided she would try to do the same exact way our people were doing it. And yes, it did come out of conversations with our people. But she made the decision. She did it. It was sovereign when she did it. And nobody else could do it because nobody else is her. So she did it. And there's an example of rediscovering or recreating a discovery, which she knew, and it may look like it's trivial, but it clearly had an impact. And it's a guidepost to a lot of other people. So she now becomes an authority, not that she wasn't before, but now this is manifest. It's different. It's like you said, Bill, about how you went in and did the intervention. So, no, I think we should stop here because I think what Bill did is the place we needed to arrive at for everybody on the call to understand what they need to do. So, Gerry, I want to thank you for being with us and thank everybody for listening. And hey, it's cool. I think people will whether it's the February 4th conference, we talked about that already. Make sure that you go to the Schiller Institute website and just take a look at it. Get the thing. It's called The Age of Reason or the Annihilation of Humanity. Go to the site to see Schiller's site. You see a picture of the Brunelleschi Dome there. And then it has the invitation underneath. You might want to get that out to people. It can help us build that process. Of course, we'll have our Saturday 2 o'clock Manhattan Town meeting. You're certainly welcome to get on and deal with that. We'll only be 2 weeks from the conference as of Saturday, so we want to get the invitation in circulation. We want people to register for the conference now, RSVP for it, and have it be of this character, this caliber of discussion. So on behalf of the LaRouche organization, we want to thank everybody for being on tonight. We'll see you on Saturday, or we'll see you here next week.